what is an architecture of optimism in a post-pandemic world. It's architecture not for the sake of architecture. It's not to glorify form, but to express its purpose in every aspect of the design.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Devers, and this is Clever. Today, I'm talking to Jordan Goldstein, an award-winning architect who is currently the head of global design and innovation for Gensler. He's led the design and project delivery of renowned commercial projects in the U.S. and abroad, including Beijing's CP Towers, China's Duke Quinchon University campus, and Washington, D.C.'s Yards waterfront neighborhood. Additionally, he's an educator and sought-after spokesperson on the future of design, both domestically and globally. But what makes this conversation so fascinating is his interdisciplinary approach and his focus on how architecture can elevate the human experience. Let's hear from Jordan.
I'm Jordan Goldstein. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I am the Global Director of Design for Gensler. I have been doing architecture and design for my entire career and love it because it is an awesome opportunity to make the world a better place through the power of design.
I always like to get the setup. Like, how did you get to be you? And to do that, I like to go all the way back to zero. So will you take us back to your childhood and where you grew up and maybe a little bit about what fascinated your young mind?
So I grew up in Rockville, Maryland, which is not that far outside of DC, and close family. I have two younger sisters. You know, we're in a small townhouse, and when I was around 5 years old, my parents started looking for a house. My dad is an attorney, and he was, working in DC. My mom was a school teacher. During the days when, he was down at the office, she would take me around while she looked at houses. We would, see houses in various points of construction. And again, I'm 5, so I'm not really probably absorbing the full intent of what they're showing. We'd come home and she would plop me on the floor next to a pile of Legos. And she would call my father and walk him through what she had seen. And I started just playing with Legos. And I think probably in my young mind, I was trying to replicate what I was seeing. And I just started getting fascinated by things that could be built. Legos were really the catalyst, I would say, at the age of 5 that got me wanting to be an architect. So since the age of 5, I've wanted to be an architect, and that's been the goal.
Wow. I think that's really fascinating that from a young age, you saw houses as they were being built and were able to kind of make that translation from their in-process stages to Legos then, to playing with it with your own mind and hands, but recognizing that it becomes a dwelling that really influences people's lives.
Well, I give my parents a lot of credit because they encouraged it. So I'm not sure I was building anything coherent at the age of 5 out of Legos, but they were, reassuring and saying, oh, okay, well, that is a house, that is a building. When I see Legos, it immediately brings me back to those moments, and just the idea that you could craft and you could create and you could start to imagine these as places, as spaces, was just so fascinating at a young age. And I think it really got me excited, kind of making that connection between what you're building and then what you're seeing. And I loved going out, to those construction sites when we, when we were doing those house tours. And, a lot of times you may see a model home and then you walk over and the next house is like halfway through construction. So being able to kind of see, a finished product and then something in production was just awesome and very, I think, inspirational at a young age. And it just gave me this feeling that the idea of design and architecture would be a profession where there's the opportunity to kind of take arts and crafts to a whole new level and be able to do something that could actually, really change how people experience the world.
So you were conscious then that there were humans involved in making all of these choices about how these houses got constructed. It wasn't an abstraction to you.
Right. And seeing workers on the construction sites and actually, one of the things I appreciate my parents did is they didn't just like walk on a construction site and walk away. Like we would sit there and watch stuff getting built for, someone at that age, seeing walls go up, seeing dirt being moved. It was fascinating. So I think it was this interesting kind of early juxtaposition of putting things together and then also seeing what the end result of that was, which was just instilled in me the idea that there is this whole nature of craft in design. It's not just about doodles on paper. It's about really thinking through what the whole experience would be of actually conceiving of an idea and then also making that, all the way through to a built reality. And then I think the other thing that was really awesome about those early experiences was being able to see all these different workers doing different things on a job site really was an early introduction to the whole idea that this is not a solo art, that this is really about collaboration. You're not going to get anything built if you're just trying to do it yourself. So being able to think through, the different players involved and how do you really play to everybody's strengths to get something truly great.
I had a similar experience it was sort of self-guided, but in the 4th grade, my elementary school went through a major renovation. So for that summer after 4th grade, my playground was the construction site. And I discovered that if I went there on weekends and after everybody was done working, that I could climb up the scaffolding, I could go into the unfinished spaces, I could check out pallets and pallets of cinder blocks that I could rearrange like giant Legos, and I made forts. And I wish that I had just had somebody there kind of explaining to me what it all did, but I still sort of figured it out through deduction,
But what a transformational experience, right? To be able to see all these components. It's like a buffet.
Yes. 100%. And it was so much more exciting than a regular playground that was all finished and just,
Right. Yeah. Much better to see that than the actual finished product in that case.
Yeah.
And to be able to put two and two together, I still get excited when I go out to a construction site and it's just raw materials and it's the early stages of construction. I still get so excited about it. And it's just like that realm of possibilities, right?
Yeah, well, you definitely found your way into the right profession then, if it's still so exciting to you. What did this translate to in your teenage years? I mean, you sort of knew you wanted to be an architect from a young age. It sounds like you didn't have to do like growing pains in that area, but I'm sure you weren't spared all the awkwardness.
Right, no growing pains in that area. I guess the funny thing, I guess, for me was it felt like once I knew what I wanted to do, then it was like, what's the quickest path from A to B? And, and how do I make sure I'm prepared for that path? So aside from all the normal stuff of teenage years of hanging with friends and, obviously going to school and trips with friends or family, I did a lot of drawing, and it wasn't like sketching, like, taking a pencil and a sketchbook and going out and like sketching landscape and so forth. It was kind of hardcore drawing. I'm not sure I really at that time knew what sketching was. It was more about, taking rulers, taking, triangles and the other accoutrements of the profession that my parents exposed me to and just sitting down and drawing house plans, floor plans, like late nights drawing tons of plans. And whether it was small homes or large homes or big buildings or small, but it didn't really matter. And it was just a lot of late nights drawing. I forget that rule of like 10,000, right? If you keep doing something over and over again, you get so familiar with it. So what I realized was that was really good training in seeing space as you draw it. So like rather than it's just lines on paper, just really truly trying to extrude those lines and imagine those as 3D realities.
Wow.
Yeah, heavy for a teenager.
Well, I mean, I'm fascinated because I'm trying to work my way into your mind there, because this is you imagining space that doesn't exist and putting lines to it, right? This isn't you sort of redrawing spaces that you've seen. This is you designing and putting lines to it. Right.
And I have this distinct memory of one day my grandmother, who also was, the whole family really encouraged it, which was great, taking me to an architect's office with the drawings that I had been doing. Again, I'm a teenager, so these aren't really, I wouldn't call them very proficient drawings, and sitting down with an architect and saying, here's what he's doing. And what do you do? Help explain what you do to him. And then what do you think of these drawings? And I remember the guy like looking through the drawings and he's like, oh, you know what? Okay, well, this kind of orientation of space makes sense. Where you put the plumbing, where you put the kitchen, all that kind of makes sense. And that was actually really reassuring. I mean, it was actually kind of wonderful moment to get exposure to what someone actually does in this profession at a relatively early age and know that what I was doing wasn't so off base, which was great. But I did find that growing up in Rockville, with DC is in immediate vicinity, we went down to DC a lot, and going down and driving around the monuments and driving around buildings that really, are truly iconic pieces of architecture and certainly stand for so much in the history of our country. Like, that was really interesting to be able to sit there. Okay, I'm drawing this house, let's say, and I can imagine what it could look like. But at the same time, over the weekend, I'm driving down with my family and we're seeing the Lincoln Memorial, or the Washington Monument, and realizing that, oh, here are buildings that have stood for a long time and have such architectural significance. How could architecture be more than just enclosure?
Yes, because you're getting a sense of the symbolism and sculptural and cultural meaning that architecture can represent, in addition to its, shelter properties.
Absolutely. And then also realizing that, okay, well, this is one particular society's view of iconic architecture. What does the rest of the world look like?
Right. Oh my gosh. Your brain must have been so hungry for exploration.
Exploding. And largely our travel as a family had been really domestic. So, we did family road trips to different parts of the country. My parents were really big on trying to expose us to different aspects of the country, just the national parks and history and so forth, which was certainly amazing. But I also really whet my appetite to what's the rest of the world look like. And it wasn't until I got into college that I had some opportunities to kind of open that window and look at a much more holistic picture of how different communities look at architecture.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because that's exactly what I want to know is, how did you do that exploration and what were the college years like for you? You already knew you were going to study architecture from 5. So it was probably a matter of just picking your schools and then figuring out how to get out to see the rest of the world.
Yeah, it would have been good if there was like instant degree, but having to go through the rigors of architectural training was definitely a surprise. I mean, the late nights in design studios on a college campus, well known that the lights are always on and the students are always there. I definitely experienced that. But I went to University of Maryland for undergraduate, which was an amazing deep dive in what I would call the tectonics of architecture, like how things get built. It was also a great just overall college experience, because there was a mix of a liberal education mixed with hardcore architecture. So, I found that I was really interested in literature and creative writing. So I got a minor in literature. What I realized, though, that doing all this exploration meant that when I got to the end of my undergraduate time, I was actually short some credits, and I needed to finish off a couple classes to graduate, and that would have to be over the summer. I had 2 choices. I could either take those classes in College Park, Maryland, which is where University of Maryland is based, or travel and I could take them abroad. So there was an opportunity to take them in Italy. So definitely check that box, right? I'm going to Italy. So I went to Italy. I'd never been to Europe, which was awesome. So basically I finished off my University of Maryland education by going to Rome with other students and being based in Rome, where the classroom was the city.
Wow.
There was no classroom. So every day we were out looking at buildings, drawing, sketching, understanding history, understanding how culture interacts with history, and with the built environment. It was a fascinating, eye-opening experience. And at the same time, it was also finishing the credits I needed to get a degree, right? But it showed me something that got me interested in global architecture and design, which was I was seeing a particular point of view. I was seeing Western architecture still. And the amazing architecture of Rome and how it has endured for centuries and eons and so forth. But what I realized is I wanted to get another perspective. I really needed to see Eastern architecture, Eastern philosophies. So I chose University of Pennsylvania for grad school for two reasons. One, at the time, they were the only university in the U.S. offering a Japan program. Two is they also were really getting into digital explorations of design.
Oh, okay.
That was kind of at the advent of digital technology coming into architecture. So, mid 90s, great time to go there. So I found that was like a full scale immersion in digital design. And what does it mean to like explore the 3D implications of your design ideas and understand that design intent, well before any hammer was, put to nail.
When you say the implications, do you mean things like wind and casting shadows and?
Yeah, all those things through renderings and animations and 3D models of buildings, digital 3D models of buildings.
Okay.
And that was new to me. Mm-hmm. And it was also really largely new to the profession at that time. This is still the age of like big clunky machines and printers that are the size of rooms. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So seeing that and experiencing that was really interesting because it's like you're okay. Well, all right. Well, instead of drawing the line on paper where the paper may be, let's say it's 20 inches by 30 inches, and that's my parameters. I'm drawing in digital space, and there are no parameters. Like I could keep drawing that line forever, right?
Right.
So that was like mind blowing. And then in the middle of all that, I went to Japan, and they had this really awesome program where you would be studying with a Japanese master in Japan. And it wasn't just going and like exploring buildings. It was literally going and learning about traditional Japanese construction and traditional Japanese architecture.
Oh,
and
wow.
Traveling around the country with this Japanese master and appreciating it from his eyes, which was such a profound change from the experiences in Rome.
Yeah, because the philosophies are so different, but also being able to travel with the master and get his particular perspective on how the success or lack of success of certain types of execution must have been really informative.
And seeing buildings that were, built 1,000+ years ago that had no nails and, were all done with beautiful craftsmanship, and yet they still stand. One of the things I really loved about his way of teaching was if you're going to go around the country and experience these places, you actually need to stay in these spaces. So what he would do is like when we would go and look at Shinto temples, we would actually stay in the temple. We would stay overnight on tatami mats on the floor.
That's so beautiful.
Wake up when the Buddhist monks were like doing their chants, and like you're really experiencing the space.
Yeah. Oh, how important that must have been to your development. I mean, because buildings are so theoretical until they're not.
Right, exactly. And then they're real, and you're like, wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So to be able to really experience all these different types of spaces, well, that just adds to your sort of toolkit and repertoire for how certain things and materials go together to create environments.
It does. And there was one final kind of blast, I would call it, from the college experiences, which is when I returned from Japan back to Philadelphia. My mind was like totally reeling from these different experiences, within a relatively short period, seeing, and being immersed in Western architecture and then being immersed in Eastern, philosophies and design, vocabulary. Then like, what do you do? I did an internship at an architect's office in Philly. And one day that architect came in and he announced aloud into the office, who's really good at model building? And he like looks over at me and he's like, you can build good models. I need you to go to Zuni, New Mexico, and stay on the Zuni Native American reservation and work with the tribe to build a model of their ancient pueblo such that they can use that model as a teaching tool to help the next generation understand how to maintain it and keep it something that lasts for centuries.
Oh, wow. What an honor.
It was so cool.
Wow.
And literally the first day I got out there, I didn't know what to expect. And I get onto the reservation, meet some members of the tribe, and they come in and they're like, "Are you ready for dancing?" And I'm like, what do they mean? Dancing? I didn't know I'd be dancing. And they're like, "It's been a drought." And I'm like, oh my gosh, they mean rain dances. And Zuni is a closed reservation. So it was an honor to be on the grounds. And it was an even more of an honor to be brought into their Pueblo kind of main square and watch these traditional rain dances and see this architecture in, the way it was meant to be used, which was, again, a mind-blowing experience right on the heels of coming back from Asia.
Wow. I'm so jealous of these experiences. But I also have a real practical question, which is what kind of relationship was in place to facilitate bringing you onto the reservation? Is that an existing framework that we can inject some energy into?
Yeah, I mean, definitely today, with certainly all the conversations we're seeing about the social inequalities and inclusiveness in communities, and making sure that all communities are represented and looked after. It is a relevant conversation for today, for sure. What facilitated it back then was one of the members of that architecture firm was affiliated with Penn, and so he taught there and had applied for a Getty grant to work with the Zuni tribe. Okay. And they had just gotten the grant. And it's a program that lasted for many years to be able to get students connected in with the Zuni Native American tribe and to help and to work together. And what was, I think, really interesting then, and I think there's so much learning that can happen through these collaborations, is, now sustainability is such an important term and resilience in our global environment. But here's a Native American tribe that is, really understanding what it means to use materials that are of the earth, and seeing that, and that their Pueblo is built out of materials that are literally brought forth from the ground right there, was a really early, your comment about toolkit is so right on. It was a really interesting kind of tool to add to the toolkit about how do we look at, the environments we're in, the sites we're looking at, and recognizing that there's potentially materials right there to build with that can better those communities.
Wow, what a formative experience. And would you say do you feel good about the model that you were able to build for a teaching tool? Do you feel good about your contribution there?
I think it was pretty good. Aesthetics are certainly in the eye of the beholder, right? So yes. I guess, in my opinion, for a college student, it was a good model. And the good thing was, what ended up happening is when I finished working there, someone else came in to pick up where I left off, and they were able to just keep going. So,
good.
So that was reassuring. But it did leave in, kind of somewhere in me that I wasn't really sure how to kind of tug at that thread. How do you help communities? And, fast forward many years, and we can certainly talk about it, at Gensler, recognizing that, since we are a global firm, are there ways to do this in any community globally? And that led to a conversation with some folks in Thailand that brought us into the slums of Bangkok, really working with residents there in the field to understand how to appreciate their communities in different ways and how to make their lives better in those communities. And that was 7-8 years ago. So that connection between the mid-90s and a latter part of my career, the threads were sewn at an early age to be able to recognize that there are these needs, and to be, for me to then be at a place like Gensler where we're able to do that, to work with communities, to work with people wherever they are in more of a borderless environment, to help try to better their worlds through design.
Well, I definitely want to dig into that project then. It sounds fascinating. But before we deconstruct that, will you just sort of connect the dots between this experience with the Native Americans to today? I mean, today you're the head of global design and innovation at Gensler. You've got many skyscrapers and built projects and awards to your name. How long have you been at Gensler, and how did you build your career to be able to get to this point?
So right after finishing at University of Pennsylvania, I was really attracted to Gensler. So I came to Gensler right after graduate school. And the reason I was attracted to the firm was, it was interesting going around interviewing at different firms. One of the things that just struck a chord with me is that Gensler at the time, was a growing firm. It was certainly, a global firm, but not nearly at the scale we're at now. But there was this conversation about culture and people at those early interviews. And, design was not overtly stated. It was almost like an undercurrent to the entire conversation. The woman that was interviewing me at the time, Diane Hoskins, who was leading the Washington, D.C. office, who's now co-CEO of the firm, it was such a, I think, fascinating way to look at design, and really connected with me with the experiences I had, learning about architecture through the lenses of these different cultures. So the idea to come into a place that was really about people and about culture, and recognizing that design is a vehicle that allows you to really enhance people's worlds of work or live or play in a way that is meaningful to them, that was, I think, really compelling. Now, that being said, I still came in as like a junior designer, so it was really kind of the early days. And in the design profession, there's such a built-in, norm of apprenticeship, go in and learn at the hands of those that have been doing it a while, and which is wonderful. But at the same time, I was coming out of Penn, like so many others at the time coming out of school, that have just been exposed to all these new digital tools, which the design firms at the time, all of them were just learning to play with. So it was an interesting time to come in and be learning as, a junior person, but at the same time recognize that there's some skill sets that me and others graduating at that time period were exposed to that actually could make us teachers in that environment. So
Yes.
we could be teaching at the same time that we're learning.
Yes. And I think that continues now, because technology and ideology and philosophy is sort of evolving so fast that I think relationships of learning are much more of a mutual exchange. The elders have wisdom and experience, and the younger people have idealism, energy, and new practices to share.
So true. And I think what's amazing now is I think we're at another point of inflection. If the mid 90s were kind of the advent of the digital wave, first wave into architecture and design, we're at this next kind of tidal wave or tsunami, where the whole idea of AI and direct to manufacturing, right from design to fabrication, 3D printing and making, all of those technologies are at play, causing those of us that are in the profession, those of us that are coming into the profession from school, to recognize that the toolbox has never been richer for designers and architects to think differently about how they go about making and designing places.
Well, and I think it's really interesting what you said, too, about what attracted you to Gensler, because it seems like there was this conversation of people and culture first, and using design to service that, as opposed to using design to impose your design philosophy onto the people and culture, which is a pretty important distinction.
A very important distinction, and you're spot on. And it's that interesting flip of the lens, where it's not architecture for architecture's sake. It's really about understanding who's the audience, who's the users, and what are their pain points. Everyone's got, depending on what the project type is, there's always these pain points, and how do you look to those rather than just want to lay a pencil down on paper and start drawing something?
So how does this all apply, this and your interest in communities, and when you work with an organization like Gensler and have the keys to the world, essentially, how did this all come together in the Bangkok project that you were talking about? Can we look at that?
Sure. Yeah. It's interesting. There was this whole kind of segue that started at the beginning of the recession in 2008. And that moment when work was really drying up in many parts of the world, and certainly in the U.S., it was a time to look at where are the opportunities, where's the work, and I followed this trail, this breadcrumb trail that got me from D.C. to India to China to Thailand, all through some client relationships, and the Thai relationship was one that really came out of work that I had been doing with our teams in Shanghai, And this was all, again, playing out against the backdrop of a recession. And one of the things we realized that in Thailand, just getting started in Bangkok, we were working with a client there, a wonderful client that is called the CP Group. Also another client tied in with them, which is called Magnolias. And they had this interest in not just development, but also in helping and bettering communities. So one of the things I started talking about with them at the time was there's an opportunity to continue to do development, but at the same time, is there a way that we can actually tie it all together, growing the next generation of architects and designers? And maybe we can actually bridge the gap between cultures and actually blend students from different parts of the world together on a common problem. And so we stitched together students from the U.S. and students from two different universities in the U.S., two different universities in Thailand, and they worked together in the field with us. We spent about 2.5 weeks in the slums of Bangkok, really going through and understanding, meeting residents, meeting community leaders there, understanding what are the pain points there. And then coming back, and all of them got an internship at Gensler to work the problem. Let's design for what we saw. We got to understand all these different audience members, these users, and we got to really listen to their challenges. How do we collectively, practitioners and students, solve for that? We did that for about 6 to 8 weeks after that. And came up with some really awesome solutions, really intriguing solutions that we presented back to the community. We shared the ideas, and we felt like it was potentially a new, model, a new paradigm of teaching design, because you're in a sense bringing together clients, practitioners, and students and faculty in a way that's really kind of action learning oriented. It's solving real problems that people have in their communities, in their cities. And I think it's one that, if you look at all the issues we are seeing today that are playing out on a global scale, that's probably really relevant to the world today.
Oh, I absolutely think so. I think the community involvement is a huge part of it, and not just the ethnography at the front end to learn the pain points and come up with solutions, but the part about going back to them and presenting possible solutions. When the community is co-architecting the solutions, then they have investment, they feel reflected, and they have some sense of ownership and pride of place. And I think that is huge. Nobody wants to live in a place that was forced upon them.
Agreed. And for us as architects and designers to tease out what is the pride of place that they either have or that they need or want.
Can you share some of the sort of pain points and some of the solutions? Yeah,
and it's led to some other things too, which I think are more opportunistic given what we're seeing in the world today. A couple of solutions that we were able to collaborate on and develop was two things related to the whole notion of community. Talking to a lot of the residents there was a pride of place. They actually really appreciated the interactivity they were having with the others that were there, that there was a multi-generational sense of belonging. So how do you support that notion of community? So one of the things we designed was this model, I'll call it a prototype, for a community center that would bring these generations together and would allow them a gathering point. Because in these slums, while there were so many residents, in a sense, living in extremely tight densities, there wasn't space for the community to gather. So being able to afford them that space, but then recognize that you have to have that space be able to handle the intense climate, the issues of flooding, heavy rains that you certainly can get there, but make it a welcoming place. What are some of the activities that you could do there? Well, one of the things we realized is that there was some amazing craftsmanship in those communities. And it wasn't really being put to the ultimate level of use. So are there products that the community can create, furniture that the community could create using materials that are found objects there that would create furniture products that could then be sold to the kind of those in the larger community beyond to help, raise money that supports the community. And so we developed a series of products that they could make using materials and components that they have at hand. So whether that's tables or benches or chairs that were very, easily made by the craftsmen that were there, that these are things that could be, commercialized or that they could be utilizing and getting revenue for their community. That led me to really realize that there are so many different ways to think about teaching today and to bringing the problems of society into the classroom in ways where students aren't just sitting there absorbing it, but they're actually getting their hands around those problems. And the classroom becomes, in a sense, almost a real-time studio environment where they're interacting with clients, they're interacting with community members and practitioners. So it doesn't create that chasm where you finish school and then you enter the real world and there's like a disconnect between what you learned and what you're actually practicing.
Right, because in school, you're allowed to let your imagination run wild, which is great on some levels, but it doesn't necessarily strengthen the real-world connections that you're talking about. So these kind of real-world workshops also allow the student to develop a real framework for a creative process that they can use out in the world.
Exactly, and it exposes them to a broader tool set at a younger age that just makes their ability to jump into the career. It's like an early springboard rather than the slow ramp up that was the conventional norm for an architect or designer.
So is this kind of thinking why that you're also drawn to teaching? Because you are also a professor.
I love it. I find that teaching definitely grows the next generation. But I think it's like kind of doing my part, and a lot of my colleagues at Gensler also teach, to build a stronger bridge between academia and practice. I learned so much by being in the classroom with students. And I'll freely admit it helps me feel younger, so that's always a good thing, right?
Yes.
But there is something about being on a college campus. It's that whole idea of the possibilities. It's inspirational. And you see all these people that are going through this learning process that will be a launching pad for them in society. But at the same time, you hope that campus is a safe environment where they can experiment, they can explore, and they can really innovate. So being able to be a part of that is thrilling. And to be able to do that in addition to the daily work I'm doing, from a global design perspective, I think just makes it much more of a well-rounded view of the world.
I wholeheartedly agree. I've done a bit of teaching as well, and I've done a fair amount of school. And the college campus environment, to me, like the most apt metaphor is it's a greenhouse. And it's just
that's a great metaphor.
So
Yes.
rich. It's like humid, and you can smell the growth, and the soil just smells like nutrients, and the chlorophyll is in the air, and things are just growing and blooming, and it's just so rich.
Yeah, endless opportunities, endless possibilities. I agree with you, and to be able to help to influence students. Fortunately, been able to teach at many different universities now, and I love to be able to experience different campuses and to try out different models for teaching. But the common denominator is trying to bring in these real world problems into the classroom. And in some cases, I've done it where it's product based, where we bring in actual product manufacturers and they drop a problem into the class, and the class is actually designing products. And then, others where it's, related to kind of big scale buildings, and others where it's even bigger scale, like urban plans or cities.
One of the other things that's really great about it, working so closely with the younger generation, is that they aren't jaded yet, and they are very idealistic frequently. I mean, you sort of need to be to throw yourself into the rigors of architecture and the idea of building a better tomorrow. And you speak about the architecture of optimism and designing to elevate the human experience. So maybe you can teach us a little bit now about your creative process and what this means, and what are some specific examples of elevating the human experience?
Sure. It is such a unusual time, right? In so many ways right now. And I think we see this for me and my colleagues at Gensler, not just, in the US, but we have, we're global. So we're looking at this, in all these different cultures and all these different societies, recognizing that there's this confluence of challenges as we think about people re-engaging with their communities, post-pandemic. Against this backdrop, we certainly have, the pandemic itself. We have economic distress. We have social inequality. We have civic unrest. All of that leads, me to believe that this is a moment to think about an architecture of optimism. And I think in order to do that, we have to start with what's the definition of optimism. I looked it up, thinking about today. And one of the ones I found was a hopefulness and confidence about the future. There's another one, which is a tendency to look on the more favorable side of events, to expect the most favorable outcome. And then two more that I thought were good were a belief that good ultimately predominates over evil in the world, and a belief that goodness pervades reality. If we take those as the baseline definitions of optimism, What is an architecture of optimism in a post-pandemic world? And I think we feel through the research we've been doing throughout Gensler and certainly for my own personal experiences, it's architecture that is empathetic and inspirational. It's causing you to appreciate the places and spaces that you're in. It's architecture that connects us to nature, to the outdoors. It brings natural light in. As I mentioned earlier, it's architecture not for the sake of architecture. It's not to glorify form, but to express its purpose in every aspect of the design. And I guess when we think about a post-pandemic world, would think that it's architecture that makes people feel safer. It's architecture they can trust and maybe promotes wellness and celebrates life. And certainly given what we're seeing in the last few weeks, that it supports inclusion and diversity, and frankly supports the human experience at every scale and level of our daily lives.
How do you do that?
Well, that's certainly the challenge, right? And I think it is the question. I definitely feel like what you were saying earlier is so spot on, which is being able to make sure that the community is involved in the process, and that it isn't a bunch of designers in the corner trying to solve for a problem that they may not fully understand.
Right.
So I definitely believe that now more so than ever before, it injects a period into the design process of listening, learning, and understanding.
And a diversity of perspectives.
Absolutely. Yes.
And that's part of listening, learning, and understanding. But I mean, that it almost needs to be spelled out so explicitly, because as you learned when you put the U.S. students with the Thai students, I'm sure there was tons of cultural information that got transmitted there that you never would have had access to when you're just trying to understand it from an anthropological perspective.
Yeah, and your comment about anthropological is so spot on. And I remember in one of my early studio experiences, growing and building a studio at Gensler, I've always believed in an interdisciplinary approach to design. It's kind of what attracted me to so many different moves in my journey, that being able to have a studio that's filled with different skill sets was really key, so that, you have a cultural anthropologist at the table, you have architects, interior designers, industrial designers, graphic designers, web designers, all around the table. And then you bring the community in, right? So that you now have a design that's made richer by the voices of many rather than being owned by any one voice. So
interdisciplinary always has made a lot of sense to me. And I've also just personally really reacted not favorably to being pigeonholed or siloed.
Right. Yeah. I agree with you there.
It makes me so itchy and uncomfortable and just frankly mad. But yet there are also challenges and roadblocks to that everywhere. So part of the practice must be a kind of finessing of this situation in order to encourage interdisciplinary participation?
Right. I agree with you. And it's interesting. I feel like in those situations and what I've experienced over the years is that, all of those moments still need a conductor of the symphony.
Yeah.
It needs someone that can really, that's not after anything about themselves. It's actually about really recognizing the strengths of everyone around the table, kind of the aces and spaces of everybody, and getting everyone to play to their strengths. Then you can potentially get the best of everybody on the table in a way that is truly like enhancing whatever the problem is, whatever the strategy is, and the solution. That's challenging. I think that's challenging in so many respects. And it requires, I think an ability to kind of step back and recognize, we're trying to put ourselves in the shoes of others. It's back to that idea of empathetic design. What's the motivation and what are the issues that the other person across the table may be coming to this situation with? And how do we make sure that they're appreciated and that they're recognized in a way that they feel that they can contribute openly to the engagement?
Yes, and that's more important than ever now, especially as we're becoming so hyper conscious of how some voices don't feel safe in expressing or that they have a real open pathway to contribution. Right, and I'm with you. And so many, there's so much pain points that we're seeing exposed, over these last few months in so many different ways that it just shows that the architects and designers today really have to recognize the sensitivities that are there, that are just inherent, that need to be appreciated in order to kind of get to the opportunities for design. Agreed. And I also think that it's such an amazing opportunity because all these pain points are being laid bare and are starting to be sort of understood by the general public in a more visceral and more graphic way. It puts a lot more pressure on and responsibility on the people who are shaping the world and the built world for tomorrow to really, really address these sort of cancers in our society and design for more. You talked about designing for well-being, and you've also talked about for creating more resilient communities. And I think society depends on it. Otherwise, we will collapse. Yeah, and I think that it says that this may be one of the most pivotal moments in design in history, in a way that we look at all these issues and that there's this amazing opportunity with this convergence of technology that we've never really seen before into design, recognizing the issues that are at play in our communities at large, that we really have this moment to think about how we are shaping the future of our cities and our communities, and to do so in ways that could really enhance and elevate the experience for those that are living in those cities or those that move to those cities in ways that we never have before. So just to kind of add some more detail to that idea, can you give us some examples or some ideas that you're toying with? For us, we've been looking at it, pre-pandemic, we were looking at, how do we approach the future of cities with a resilient mindset? How do we bring this kind of what we've been calling our global, cities climate challenge to the table, which is really challenging every project, every, client that we're working with, every community that we engage with, to think about sustainability at a totally different level. With the onset of the pandemic, we started to weave in thinking about how do we make it more about global wellness, where it's actually trying to make the world healthier and better for all of us, right? Not just a better planet, but a better place to live in, that we're truly enhancing and elevating the experiences for all. And then you add in the other experiences with the economy, you add in the social inequalities that have been laid bare and the civic unrest. And it really is an opportunity to, think very differently about, what does it mean to have a town square? A plaza? What does it mean to, have, mixed use?
And what does that mixed use equation really want to dial itself to, recognizing everything we've been experiencing, over the last couple of months? What it's allowed us to do is look at some of these problems with, I think, a really fresh perspective with our clients. So there's been mixed use projects that we've been looking at, in some of our communities that start to think about how do we actually create places for community to gather? Mm-hmm. How do we, in a safe and healthy manner, how do we create buildings that actually, for those mixed use components that have wellness woven into them? So they are healthy buildings. They are buildings that actually recognize that where they are in the climate, in a sense that they can have, potentially breathable skins. We did a tower in Pittsburgh for PNC that is when it was built a few years ago, it was the greenest building in North America. And it had a breathable skin to it, such that it had tied into technology that recognized that when it was good weather days, mm-hmm. that the skin literally opened up and there's natural ventilation flowing through the building. So imagine that workplace environment, versus say a sealed one, mm-hmm. And being able to have that opportunity to have that fresh air and be able to feel like you're in a healthier building is important. But I think it goes further. It can actually then transcend to the overall program. Mm-hmm. So whether it's the retail and the food and beverage experiences, whether it's the hospitality experiences that are in that mixed use equation, all of those can be looked at through these different lenses in a way that they become, much more about, plugins to cities that actually help better the context, not just the immediate block that they're in.
I can feel that when I'm in a building, I'm sensitive to space anyway. I'm a designer and I think about space like that. But when I'm in a building and I can feel that I'm part of a working system, that feels better to me. Not just a block of concrete that's supposed to sort of dominate nature and create boundaries, but a building that sort of works as part of the larger ecosystem. I know there's a skyscraper that you designed that has, instead of a spire, it has an inverted cone at the top to collect rainwater.
Right, Shanghai Tower. Yes, yeah. We did this tower in downtown Shanghai, right in Pudong, which is it was basically like the skyscraper garden of Shanghai. And you're right, it has an inverted cone at the top that harvests rainwater that's used for irrigation of some of the interior gardens of the building. It also has wind turbines built into the top of the building as well that helps offset some of the power needs for the building. It's actually like a vertical city. If you took multiple city blocks and kind of turned them from horizontal to vertical, that's, like a concept in Shanghai Tower. And similarly, if we stay in China for a second, there's a project I did with our teams in actually a similar moment, in a sense. It was amidst of the global economic crisis that began in 2008. And it's for Duke University. And it's called Duke Quinchon University. And it's a new university outside of Shanghai. And to your point that you just raised, it was a full campus built at once, but it is totally a part of the ecosystem that's around it. It actually is the first LEED campus in China, and it is a true blending of East and West architectural languages. The site itself was farmland that had a really high water table. And it's in a part of the outskirts of Shanghai that has these, traditional water towns. So there's a town called Zhuangzhou that is, a water town, which is like a Venice of China. Mm-hmm. And what we realized is that, to actually have this campus feel like it is part of this community and that it actually take advantage of the site, it can't be like a dense series of high rises, feeling like you're in downtown Beijing or downtown Shanghai. It needs to be low rise. It needs to be of the earth. It needs to be human scale. It needs to, use water to tell a story. So instead of the traditional kind of, campus quad, where you have the big lawn and you have these buildings around it, we actually just literally let the water come up that was literally a meter below the ground. And the entire campus, main kind of heart of the campus, is stitched around this body of water. And then these bridges that cross it and create these wonderful places that people can learn outdoors or they can learn indoors. And it promotes that idea that learning can happen anywhere. And it's this series of buildings that feel like there's a human scale to them, and that it's something that feels like it sits on this former farmland and not something that, in a sense, towers over it.
Wow, that sounds magical. I'd like to go there.
Well, I wish we both could go there right now for a visit, but it is interesting. I did go back there in last fall and didn't say anything about that I was an architect on the project or whatever. And I just walked around and talked to students. And we talked earlier about pride of place, and there was such a pride of place, and that people were just sitting around and appreciating the outdoors or the indoors or the relationship of the buildings to the outdoors. And I walked away feeling really good. And we talked about like creating projects that help communities and plug in. It felt like that these students were really appreciating their surroundings and appreciating the moment in time for them that was supported by the architecture.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's one thing to sort of analyze what problems need to be solved and then design around solving those problems and then apply them. But you really, in order to know if that worked, in order to inform your future explorations and projects, you need to know what was successful or not successful about it. You sometimes don't know that for 5 or 10 years after the project's built.
So true. And being able to try to figure out the life cycle is, I think, is a good point. I mean, being able to revisit projects and go back through buildings and try playing our hand at being the users, not just the designers. There's so much learning that can happen from that. And it can inform adjustments to those projects. It can inform how we approach new projects.
Yeah. Okay, so I have kind of a question that's on my mind a lot. Buildings and, even residences, smart homes and skyscrapers are getting more and more technologically advanced. And there are some technological advancements that pose obvious benefits, but also can be problematic. For instance, I can see a number of ways how facial recognition might be helpful in a large building system. But it's also racist and, rife with potential problems. So are you ever haunted by the possibility that some idealistic technological implementation could turn sour?
You raise a really challenging and interesting point to where we are with the, I would call it the ascent of the prop tech world, the whole Internet of Things now making its way into architecture. And it creates a very, I think, unique moment where architecture can be smart. We in many ways want it to be smart so that we're able to learn how our buildings are performing, learn how our buildings are being used, learn how space is being, appreciated or used, and actually monitor it so that we're not overusing energy, that we're actually being conscious of, how we can, actually make things more efficient. But at the same time, user access, being able to have, biometric security to come into a building. You're right. There are definitely the pros and cons of that. And it raises the question of like how much opt-in should be, brought into the equation. Mm-hmm. I know for me, I went back to our office a couple of weeks ago just to pick up some things, and recognizing the whole pandemic, I was thinking about how many surfaces I was touching to go from my car to, into the building, through the lobby up to the floors that we're on. And I'm like, wow, there are ways to do this touchless. In this particular moment in time, I would be okay with being able to opt in such that I could have a touchless journey. And many people may disagree with that, but I was thinking about how many times I had to apply Purell to my hands and check my face mask and, put on gloves. And I was thinking, if I didn't have to touch anything, would that be a better journey? And in this particular case, it would have been. Is that going to be true every day? Don't know. But for the moment, it feels like there's kind of a short-term reaction to this, a midterm and a long-term.
Mm-hmm.
And for investments in tech, the tech will certainly change. But the question is also what tech can be brought in that's such that it's the software that updates, rather than having to go rip things out of the building and put new things in, such that things can change potentially even on a daily basis.
Yeah, and it also means what happens when the building becomes fixed is that then society changes to adapt to the building. And that's what you don't want. That's the scenario you want to avoid.
And I wonder, with the advent of so much digital experience in architecture, are we getting to a point, and we have a team that's actually been exploring this with clients, the digital experience team, which is, what happens when your architecture actually can be ever changing? So when your architecture, let's say it's your building facades, your building skins, or components of buildings that are done in a way with technology infused into them that they can actually change their appearance. And I know it feels like so far off, but the technology's there now. Actually the building could change as society changes, which totally, transforms the equation.
I mean, it's scary too, because there's a level of sort of ground shifting under your feet kind of thing. If the world around you is shape shifting and morphing, then it can be hard to get your bearings. But if it's sort of shape shifting in the way that a tree does, like a slow growth that can respond to the environment in terms of, leaning towards the sun and being resilient and moving its branches in the wind, that makes sense to me.
I agree with you, because I think that's where it's get really interesting, where let's say that there's some shifts in climate such that the building actually needs to morph a bit to actually work with the climate. Mm-hmm. That could be done in a way that actually makes it better for those that are using the building and better for those that are, living around the building. That could be amazing and transformative. But at the same time, if it's technology that just is, I want the building to look blue today and green tomorrow, that I'm not sure that does it.
Right. Well, and there's also, I always go back to the light switch, because there's something really trusty and reliable about reaching out to the same spot in every room to find that light switch. And if the light switch isn't there, and you don't know which app you need to fiddle with to turn on the lights, there's a feeling of real insecurity.
Standing in darkness for hours.
Yeah.
It's interesting that we can do that now. And the same thing is true with a door handle. I know where the door handle is, but what happens if, I don't want to touch the door handle, right? So there's a set of levers that can be pulled in different ways to take projects one direction or another. I think there's also another question that's out there too, given all the, discussions about resilience and sustainability. Do we need to build new? Can we think about how we can reuse what we have in society as bones for something different, rather than just knocking it down and building new?
Oh, I 100% believe in, adapting the bones for something that we need. I feel really uncomfortable when all signs of history have been erased, and it feels like when everything's
totally
too new,
right?
I don't feel comfortable at all.
Right.
It does not give me a sense of any sort of depth of roots. I don't trust anything around me. And I don't know which corporate levers were in charge of this. It
feels so clean that you don't know, something just doesn't feel right.
I need history. And that's one of the magical things about your trip to Rome, right? DC, while chock full of monuments and symbolism that represent the American journey, it's young compared to Rome. And when you can go and experience that level of cultural depth, I think you have much more of a connection to humanity than when everything's being sort of erased and rebuilt around you.
I agree with you. And, we living and growing up in DC, I remember there was a part of DC that, I really didn't know about. And, DC is really a two-river town, but I grew up thinking it was a one-river town because I really didn't understand, about this other side of the city. And through some opportunities, there was, this site that used to be part of the Navy Yard that was making battleships during World War II. After World War II finished, the Navy kind of, contracted back to a smaller footprint, and it left this part of the city where, again, didn't know about it, but there came a time that, it was an opportunity to think differently about, the growth of neighborhoods in the city. And this area it's called the Yards. It's a new neighborhood in DC. And it's been written about a lot now, but it revitalized a waterfront. It brought attention to a part of town that definitely needed it. And it reused a lot of old buildings in a way that kind of gave new life to these old bones. And they're amazing spaces. And then certainly there's sprinkling in of new buildings, but it's that, like you said, it's that rich tapestry now of old and new together, on the banks of a waterway that, people didn't really understand and couldn't appreciate. And now it's all kind of coming together in a way that says that, community can happen here. It doesn't all have to be new.
Yes. I mean, and the High Line is a great example of that.
Absolutely.
As well.
Yeah.
And I think the story of the High Line is so much richer and so much more important to the city, knowing what it was to begin with.
Right. And I agree with you. And the beauty of the High Line is that now it's this connected thread that feels like it was always a part of the city.
Yeah.
It's like you can't imagine the city without it.
Right. Okay. So I've got one last question that is important. We haven't talked about you personally too much, but I know you're a father of 2 daughters.
I am.
And I'm sure they have all the Legos they could dream of having.
They are amazing daughters. My older daughter does not want to be a designer, which is great. She wants to be an actress.
Okay.
So she's going to Northwestern University in the fall. So very excited for her, proud of what she's doing. And our younger daughter wants to be an interior designer, which I'm also really excited about for different reasons, right?
Yeah.
But I guess I hope that when they're through with their education, that they emerge in a world that truly appreciates all voices equally, so that whether it's the 2 of them or others, that they can be equal parts contributor to society, and that their voices are heard loud and clear, just like everybody else's.
Well, and it sounds like you're doing your part to build a society that does allow for equal valuation of all voices.
Well, thank you. We are certainly trying. And, I think the nice thing about the environment that we've created at Gensler is it is an environment that appreciates all voices globally and recognizes that, we are truly trying to shape, the future of our communities and our cities. And that this moment in time that we're all in, I think sorely points out the need for us to give attention to all, not just a few.
Well put. Thank you so much, Jordan. Thank you for sharing your story and your smarts and the nature of the work that you're doing. This has been really fascinating.
It's been great talking with you. Thanks for bringing me on, and really looking forward to future dialogues.
Hey, thanks for listening. To see images of Jordan's work and read the show notes, click the link in the details of this episode on your podcast app, or go to cleverpodcast.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletter. Subscribe to Clever on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you would, please do us a favor and rate and review. It really does help a lot. We also love chatting with you on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find us at Clever Podcast, and you can find me at Amy Devers. Clever is produced by 2VDE Media, with editing by Rich Stroffolino, production assistance from Laura Jaramillo, and music by El1011. Clever is proudly distributed by Design Milk.